It was a clear, almost cloudless summer morning in Norfolk. Betty Q woke up at 6:30 sharp, as usual, without an alarm clock, a habit left over from 30 years of teaching elementary school. She sat up slowly on the bed, writhing against the aching pain in her back, and reached for the slippers carefully placed from the evening before. The bedroom window was ajar, and a light breeze ruffled the faded curtains in a small floral pattern. The first thing Betty did was to go into the kitchen and turn on the kettle. While the water was boiling, she took out of the refrigerator a jar of jam she'd made last week from her own strawberries. A few minutes later, she was sitting at the small kitchen table, sipping strong tea and listening to the morning news on the radio. The announcer was cheerfully announcing the weather forecast for the next few days, promising sunshine and warmth. "It's about time to get to work on the flower beds," Betty murmured, taking a bite of toast with jam. After breakfast, she changed into faded jeans and a roomy t-shirt, her favorite gardening clothes, and went out into the yard. Her small house on the outskirts of Norfolk was surrounded by a modest but manicured lot. To the left of the driveway were the roses Betty had grown for more than a decade. To the right was a vegetable garden with neat beds of greens, carrots, and beets. Betty put on her gardening gloves and began weeding around the roses. The work was monotonous but soothing. She let her thoughts flow freely, not concentrating on anything in particular. Sometimes memories came to mind of her late husband, Roy, of how they'd planted those roses together, of how he'd laughed when he'd said she had a green thumb. 3 years had passed since his death, and the pain of loss still felt like a fresh wound, especially on such quiet mornings. "Good morning, Betty, early bird, as always." Looking over the low wooden fence was her neighbor, Esther Paul, a 72-year-old widow with bright red hair, obviously dyed but always neatly styled. "Good morning, Esther," Betty smiled, straightening up and rubbing her lower back. "I thought I'd get to work on the roses before the heat starts." "Clever, clever," Esther nodded. "I'm waiting for the paper. They say they're going to print the results of our garden competition today. Have you seen my dahlias? This year's dahlias are marvelous." "Yes, they're beautiful," Betty replied sincerely. "You're going to win for sure." "Oh, I don't know." Esther flirtatiously fixed her hair. "The Jenkinses have great dahlias, too. But mine are better, of course," she winked conspiratorially. They chatted for a few more minutes about gardening, the weather forecast, and the fact that the prices at the local supermarket had gone up again. Then Esther left to meet the mailman, and Betty went back to her roses. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the sun was getting hot, so Betty decided to take a break. She went into the house, washed her hands, and poured herself a glass of cold lemonade from the pitcher in the refrigerator. With the drink, she settled into her favorite chair in front of the television, an old but comfortable one with worn armrests and faded upholstery. Turning on the TV, Betty found herself in the middle of a cooking show. A young host with perfect hair and makeup was demonstrating how to prepare a complicated Italian dish. Betty watched without much interest. She preferred simple, straightforward food to these fancy delights. But the show served as a background while she browsed through the latest issue of a gardening magazine. After an hour, Betty turned off the TV and went into the kitchen to make dinner. She lived alone and could, of course, just heat up something ready-made, but cooking was something of a ritual for her. Today, she decided to make a simple vegetable soup from what grew in her vegetable garden. As she sliced carrots into thin circles, Betty pondered the days ahead. On Thursday, she would have to go to the clinic for a routine checkup. On Friday, she would have to go to the library to drop off books. What to do on the weekend? Should I call my daughter, suggest we get together? She and Rebecca have always had a complicated relationship. As a child, her daughter was attached to her mother, but problems began in her teens. Rebecca thought her mother was too conservative, not understanding modern life. They often argued, Sometimes it came to tears and slamming doors. After Rebecca met and married Hugh, her relationship with her mother became even more strained. Hugh had never hidden his dislike for his mother-in-law, considering her a boring old woman. Betty sighed heavily as she poured the sliced carrots into the boiling water. Anyway, Rebecca is her only daughter, and she has two wonderful grandchildren, 12-year-old Austin and 8-year-old Nell. For their sake, it was worth putting up with an unpleasant son-in-law and a cold daughter. After lunch, Betty decided to take a nap, another habit of the last few years. She lay down on the sofa in the living room, covered herself with a light blanket, and almost immediately fell into slumber. She dreamed of her husband, young and healthy, calling her to follow him somewhere. She wanted to go, but something held her back. The ringing of the telephone woke Betty. She struggled to get out of the plaid and hurried to the phone on the nightstand at the entrance to the kitchen. Dash, dash, hello, she said, still not fully awake. Mom, it's me. Rebecca's voice sounded strained. Rebecca, it's so good of you to call. I was just thinking. Betty began, but her daughter interrupted her. Yes, yes, Mom. Look, I don't have a lot of time. I'm calling to see how you're doing. I'm fine, thank you, Betty replied, feeling a familiar disappointment. It was always like this, Rebecca calling as if on duty, asking about her health, but not listening to the answer. How are you? How are the children? They're fine, Rebecca answered quickly. Austin, well, he needs a new uniform for gym class. The school wants a special one with a logo on it, and the old one's worn out. Betty knew what she was talking about right away. It wasn't the first time. First, a long silence, then a sudden call and some urgent need that required financial assistance. How much are these uniforms costing? Betty asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. 120 pounds, Rebecca answered with a casual nonchalance. I know it's expensive, but what can you do? School rules. Betty mentally calculated her budget. Her pension was modest, but she always tried to save a little for a rainy day, and for those requests from her daughter, which came with regularity. Okay, I'll help, she said after a pause. When do you need the money? The sooner the better, Rebecca said. Why don't you come over on Saturday? The kids would love to see you. The children might be, Betty thought, but said aloud, all right, Saturday. What time would be best? Let's be there by lunchtime, about 2 o'clock, Rebecca suggested. But, Mom, she lowered her voice, don't tell Hugh about the money, okay? You know he's proud. Proud? Betty could barely keep from laughing bitterly. Pride didn't stop Hugh from regularly taking money from his mother-in-law through his wife. I won't tell, she promised. I'll see you Saturday, dear. Bye, Mom. Rebecca quickly hung up the phone. Betty slowly returned the phone to the base. A familiar feeling of fatigue and frustration swept over her. She knew for a fact that the money was unlikely to go toward uniforms for Austin. Last time, it had been an emergency repair of the washing machine. But when Betty arrived 2 weeks later, there was no new washing machine in the house. But Hugh was sporting new sneakers, and Rebecca had a new haircut and manicure. But what could she do? It was her daughter, her grandchildren, the only family she had left after Roy's death. Sighing, Betty went back into the kitchen and made herself some fresh tea, then sat down at the table and began to make a shopping list for tomorrow. She needed to buy groceries for the week, and she also needed to withdraw money for Rebecca. 120 pounds. Not an insignificant sum for a pensioner. The evening passed in the usual routine. Betty watered her roses, watched the evening news, ate a light salad, and read a detective story borrowed from the library. At 10 o'clock, she went to bed as usual, setting her alarm clock for 6:30, though she knew she would wake up without it. Lying in bed, Betty thought about her upcoming meeting with her daughter and son-in-law. An inner voice told her it was time to stop this cycle of financial dependence, that she was being used. But another part of her being, the maternal part, objected. This is your daughter, your blood. How can you say no? With these conflicting thoughts, Betty fell into a restless dream in which she was a young teacher again, and little Rebecca was holding her hand, looking up trustingly from below. Mommy, said the little girl in her dream, I love you so much. And Betty's heart clenched with tenderness and longing for times that were long gone and would never return. Saturday morning greeted Betty with a chilly wind and drizzling rain. She stood at the bus stop, wrapping herself more tightly in her old wool coat. Despite the midsummer weather, it was typical English weather, unpredictable and capricious. Yesterday the sun had been shining, but today the sky was covered with gray clouds, with fine watery dust falling from them and settling on her hair and clothes. Betty stepped from foot to foot, adjusting the bag on her shoulder. In the bag was an envelope containing 120 pounds, all she'd been able to set aside from her last pension. She knew the money would hardly be used for Austin's uniform, but she decided to give it to him anyway. After all, it wasn't his grandson's fault that his parents were so irresponsible with their finances. The bus pulled up at 9:30 sharp. Betty was relieved to get on, showed her bus pass to the elderly driver, who nodded at her with his customary politeness, and walked to the center of the bus. The bus was almost empty, with only a few passengers seated, absorbed in their own thoughts. Betty chose a window seat and made herself comfortable, ready for the half-hour ride across Norfolk. When the bus started, she leaned her forehead against the cool glass and watched the streets go by. The rain had intensified, and the drops dripping down the window distorted the view outside, turning familiar buildings and trees into blurred silhouettes. It was melancholy, and Betty's thoughts turned involuntarily to the past. She remembered the first time she had brought little Rebecca to Norfolk. At that time, she and Roy had just moved here from London, having bought a small house on the outskirts. Rebecca was only 5 years old, a cheerful little girl, with 2 blonde pigtails and freckles on her nose. She held her mother's hand tightly and gazed around excitedly. Mommy, and we will live close to the sea? She asked. Will we be able to go to the beach every day? Betty smiled, explaining that they would still have to take the bus to the sea, but that they would definitely go there on weekends. And they did go. In good weather, they collected shells, built sand castles, ate ice cream on the promenade. Rebecca loved those trips and always begged her parents to stay longer. The bus passed the elementary school where Betty had worked for 30 years, and it brought back a new wave of memories. When Rebecca went into first grade, Betty took a job there as a teacher. It wasn't easy. Some co-workers thought it wasn't a good idea to teach in the same school as your child. But for Betty, it was a practical choice. She could look after her daughter, and it was only a 15-minute walk to work. For the first few years of school, Rebecca was proud that her mom was a teacher. She often dropped by Betty's classroom at recess to help put her books away and wipe down the blackboard. After school, they'd walk home together, and Rebecca would talk nonstop about her friends, her teachers, and what she'd learned during the day. But everything changed when Rebecca turned 12. Suddenly, she was embarrassed that her mother worked at the school. She stopped going into Betty's classroom, tried to avoid her in the hallways. At home, she spent hours locked in her room, listening to loud music, snapping at her parents' questions. It's normal, her husband reassured Betty. All children go through this. Transition, hormones. But for Betty, it was painful. Where had her sweet, open girl gone? Where had that sullen, constantly irritated teenage version come from? The bus turned onto the high street, and Betty snapped out of her musings. This was the place to get off. The sign for the shopping center, where she was going to buy gifts for her grandchildren and daughter, was visible ahead. The rain had almost stopped when she stepped onto the sidewalk. After adjusting her scarf and buttoning her coat, Betty made her way to the entrance of the mall. It was warm and crowded inside. Saturday was a day for families to go shopping. Betty looked with involuntary envy at the young mothers with their children, at the elderly couples walking hand in hand. She missed the company, especially on days like this. Since Roy's death, loneliness had been her constant companion. The first thing she did was stop by the candy department. Austin loved chocolate and Nell loved gummy bears. Betty chose a large bar of milk chocolate with nuts for her grandson and a colorful box of multicolored gummy bears for her granddaughter. Rebecca and Hugh may have thought Grandma was spoiling the children with sweets, but Betty couldn't come empty-handed. After paying for the candy, she took the escalator up to the second floor, where the clothing and accessories department was located. A week ago, on a previous visit to the mall, she had noticed a beautiful silk scarf that she thought would fit Rebecca perfectly. Blue with a silver pattern, it reminded Betty of her daughter's childhood love of all things mermaid, as she called it. Fortunately, the scarf was still on sale. Betty took a long look at it, assessing the quality of the fabric and the pattern. 45 pounds wasn't cheap for her budget, especially since she was already preparing to give her daughter 120. But something inside, perhaps, a mother's ineradicable hope of reconciliation, made her pull out her wallet and pay for the purchase. The saleswoman carefully wrapped the scarf in thin paper and placed it in an elegant bag with the store's logo. Betty thanked her and, clutching the bag to her chest, headed for the exit of the mall. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained gray and low. Betty glanced at her watch. It would be another hour and a half before she could see her daughter. She decided to stop at a small cafe across the street from the mall for a cup of tea and a break. The cafe was cozy, with wooden tables and soft armchairs. Betty ordered tea and a slice of carrot cake, her favorite. As she settled by the window, she continued to reflect on her relationship with her daughter. When Rebecca turned 16, the conflicts between them had peaked. Her daughter began dating boys, coming home past midnight, skipping classes. Betty tried to be strict, set rules, forbid, punish, but it only made things worse. Roy took a softer stance, believing that her daughter should be given space to make her own bumps and learn from her mistakes. "You're putting too much pressure on her," he told Betty. "She's suffocating under your control." Those words hurt. Betty didn't see herself as a controlling mother. She just wanted to keep her daughter from making mistakes that could ruin her life. But perhaps Roy was right. Perhaps her fears and anxieties were being transmitted to Rebecca, causing even more resistance. When Rebecca graduated from high school, she announced that she didn't want to go to university as her parents had planned. Instead, she got a job at a local beauty salon and rented an apartment with a friend. Betty was disappointed. She had always hoped that her daughter would get a higher education, become a doctor or a lawyer. But Rebecca was adamant. "I want to live my own life, Mom," she said then, "not the one you made up for me." And so, at 23, Rebecca met Hugh Gill. He was 5 years older, working as a technician for a company installing smart home systems. Tall, thin, with slicked back dark hair and always a bit of a sneering look, he hadn't made a good impression on Betty from the very first time she'd met him. "He's kind of cold," she shared her doubts with her husband, "and he looks at Rebecca like he owns her." "Come on." Roy dismissed her. "He's just shy. Give him time to get used to it." But as time went on, Betty's dislike of Hugh grew. She noticed how he gently but insistently controlled Rebecca, what she should wear, who she should socialize with, how she should spend her money. Under his influence, her daughter became even more distant from her parents. She rarely called, even less came to visit. And when they announced their engagement, Betty felt not joy, but anxiety. The wedding was modest. Hugh's parents were not rich, and he himself did not want to throw money away on an empty show, as he called it. Betty and Roy offered to pay for a more lavish celebration, but Rebecca refused, saying that she and Hugh decided everything. A year after the wedding, Austin was born. Another 4 years later, Nell was born. Betty was happy to be a grandmother and hoped the grandchildren would help reconnect her with her daughter. But Hugh jealously guarded his family space, reluctantly allowing his mother-in-law and father-in-law to see his grandchildren. The children should have their own lives without the constant interference of grandparents, he said when Betty asked to bring the children for the weekend. After Roy's death 3 years ago, things got worse. Hugh seemed to have stopped hiding his dislike of his mother-in-law altogether. He could purposely leave with the children when Betty came to visit, or defiantly go off to another room without saying hello. Rebecca never stood up for her mother, silently accepting her husband's behavior. The only thing that didn't change was the regular requests for financial help. Hugh was ambitious, but not particularly successful in his work. He changed jobs frequently, believing he was undervalued, underpaid, and not given opportunities for growth. The family was constantly living in debt, and Betty became something of an emergency fund for them in case of crisis. At first, she gave money without question. It's for her grandchildren, she told herself. Then she began to ask what the money was for. Rebecca always found plausible explanations: a broken refrigerator, a school field trip, urgent roof repairs. But as time went on, Betty began to notice that the promised purchases or repairs never materialized, while her daughter and son-in-law could still afford new clothes or gadgets. She finished her tea, paid, and left the cafe. It was a 20-minute walk to Rebecca's house, so Betty decided not to wait for the bus. The weather had improved. The sun was even peeking through the clouds. Walking along the familiar streets, Betty continued to reflect on her relationship with her daughter in recent years. Since Roy's death, she had often felt very alone in her small house. There were few friends, mostly former school colleagues with whom she would occasionally meet for a cup of tea, but there was no real intimacy with anyone. She had hoped that Rebecca would be a support for her in her old age, that they would become closer when her daughter became a mother herself and would understand parental feelings better. But that didn't happen. Rebecca was immersed in her own problems, in the complex relationship with Hugh, in the upbringing of children. There was room in her life for her mother only when she needed money or help with her grandchildren. Yet Betty continued to hope. Every time she went to see her daughter, she thought, maybe something will change today. Maybe we'll finally have a heart-to-heart talk, understand each other. But the meetings always followed the same pattern: strained smiles, superficial conversations about the weather and health, Hugh defiantly ignoring his mother-in-law, and Rebecca squeezed between them, hesitant to take sides. Betty turned down the street where her daughter and her family lived, a row of identical two-story houses with small front gardens. Rebecca and Hugh's house was the third one on the right, with a blue front door and pots of flowers on the windowsills. Those flowers were the only thing that brightened up the rather drab facade. As she approached the house, Betty noticed that the curtains on the windows were drawn, even though it was almost 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Perhaps Hugh was still asleep? He worked in shifts, and sometimes he had night shifts. She paused in front of the door for a moment, gathering her wits. In her hands were bags of gifts for her grandchildren and daughter. In her bag, an envelope of money that probably wouldn't go toward a sports uniform for Austin. And in her heart, the eternal hope that today would be different, that her daughter would hug her and say, "Thank you, Mom, for having you." Taking a deep breath, Betty pressed the bell button. A melodious trill sounded inside the house, and a few seconds later, footsteps were heard. The door swung open. The door was opened by Hugh. He was in house pants and a stretch t-shirt, his face stubbled and his hair disheveled, as if he had just gotten out of bed, even though it was early afternoon. When he saw his mother-in-law on the doorstep, he didn't bother to hide his irritation. His face contorted into a grimace, and without even saying hello, he turned and shouted into the house, "Rebecca, why has that old vermin come here?" Betty froze in place, pierced by these words as by a stab of a knife. In 3 years of widowhood, she had grown accustomed to all sorts of dislike from her son-in-law: cold glances, blatant ignoring, sarcastic remarks. But he had not yet allowed himself such open rudeness. Rebecca appeared in the hallway. She was wearing a simple house dress, her hair in a careless bun. She saw her mother on the doorstep, heard her husband's words, but said nothing, just lowered her eyes and took a step back, as if she wanted to hide behind a wall. Betty's first instinct was to turn around and walk away. Why endure such treatment? Why stay where you were so unwelcome? But the thought of her grandchildren who were waiting for their grandmother stopped her. And something else, maybe a habit she'd developed over the years of smoothing over sharp edges, of not causing trouble, of being nice. "It's all right, dear," Betty said with a strained smile, turning to Hugh. "Rebecca and I agreed that I would come to see the grandchildren today." She stepped inside, past her son-in-law, who made no move to step aside. The hallway was dark and smelled musty, a mixture of stale linens, dust, and stale air. Betty thought uneasily that the house looked neglected. Rebecca had always been neat, loving cleanliness and order. What had been going on here lately? "Mom," Rebecca finally said, not making eye contact. "You're early. We're not quite ready yet." "I brought something for the kids," Betty said, showing the bags. "Are they home?" "Austin's upstairs playing on the computer," Rebecca answered. "And Nell is in the living room, watching cartoons." Hugh finally closed the front door and walked past them into the kitchen, deliberately hitting Betty with his shoulder. She staggered but stayed on her feet, clutching the gift bags tighter. "Would you like some tea?" Rebecca asked, still avoiding a direct look. "Yes, I'd love some," Betty replied, trying to keep her voice normal. She undressed, hung her coat on the hook in the hallway, and walked into the living room. The room looked as unkempt as the hallway: toys scattered about, dust on surfaces, stains on the carpet. 8-year-old Nell sat on the couch with her legs tucked under her, staring at a tablet screen. She didn't even look up when Betty walked in. "Hi, sweetie," Betty called softly. "How is my favorite granddaughter doing?" Nell finally pulled herself away from the screen and looked at her grandmother. A smile appeared on her face, a genuine, childlike smile that reminded Betty of little Rebecca. "Grandmother!" exclaimed the girl and jumped off the couch to hug Betty. "You've come." Betty hugged her granddaughter, inhaling the smell of her hair, strawberry-scented shampoo and something subtly childlike, pure. At times like this, she realized why she kept coming to this house, despite her daughter's coldness and her son-in-law's open hostility. "I brought you something," Betty said, handing Nell a bag of gummy bears. The girl's eyes widened with delight. "They're my favorite. Thank you, Grandma. Just don't eat them all at once." Betty smiled. "Where's your brother? I brought something for him, too." "Austin." Nell shouted so loudly that Betty shuddered. "Grandmother has come and brought presents." An inarticulate grunt came from upstairs, followed by the sound of footsteps on the stairs. A few seconds later, Austin appeared in the living room, a thin 12-year-old boy with a serious look from under his bangs and slouching shoulders. He looked remarkably like Roy at the same age, and Betty's heart sank every time she saw him. "Hi, Grandma," he said without much enthusiasm, but he still came over to hug her. Betty noticed that his t-shirt looked worn and his jeans were a little short. The boy must have grown since her last visit. She handed him a bag of chocolates. "Your favorite, with nuts," she said. Austin finally smiled. his face lighting up with childlike joy for a moment. Thank you. He immediately unwrapped the candy bar and broke off a piece. Do you want some? No, thank you, sweetie. It's for you, Betty said, touched by his willingness to share. Rebecca entered the room with a tray of cups and a teapot. Children, don't bother your grandmother, she said. Go play and we'll talk to her. Austin shrugged and went back upstairs, while Nell climbed back onto the sofa with her tablet and a bag of jelly beans. Rebecca set the tray on the coffee table and poured tea into 2 cups. Her movements were mechanical, as if she was performing a routine task that required no emotional involvement. How are you doing, Mom? She asked, holding out a cup to Betty. Fine, thank you, Betty replied, taking the tea. And how are you? How are the children? How's work? Rebecca shrugged her shoulders. The usual. Austin doesn't want to do his homework. Nell's cranky. Hugh? She faltered. Hugh's having trouble at work. Again. What's wrong? Betty asked, though she already knew the answer. He'd had a row with his boss. He says he's picking on him, doesn't value his knowledge and experience, Rebecca said quietly, as if she was afraid her husband would hear. He's thinking of quitting. Betty took a sip of tea to hide her worry. If Hugh quit, it would be the 4th job change in 2 years. And every time it's been for the same reason, conflicts with his bosses. What about you? How's your work at the salon? Betty asked, trying to change the subject. It's fine, Rebecca shrugged. We're getting a lot of clients, but the owner cut our percentage of revenue, said the expenses had gone up. They were silent for a moment. The conversation didn't flow as it usually did. Betty thought of all the things she wanted to say to her daughter about her loneliness, about how much she missed being with her, about how worried she was about her grandchildren growing up in an atmosphere of constant tension and lack. But the words stuck in her throat, unable to get out. I bought you something, Betty said at last, handing Rebecca a bag of scarves. I saw it in the store and thought it might be a good color for you. Rebecca took the bag with some surprise. She took out the scarf, unwrapped it, and ran her fingers over the soft fabric. It's beautiful, she said after a pause. Thank you, Mom. There was no joy in her voice, but Betty thought for a second that something flashed in her daughter's eyes. Perhaps a shadow of her former intimacy. A memory of a time when they had understood each other half-heartedly. There was a rumble from the kitchen. It sounded as if Hugh had dropped something, and then a torrent of cursing. Rebecca shuddered and quickly folded the scarf back into the bag, as if hiding a clue. He's not in the mood today, she muttered. I'm sorry for what he said when you came in. Betty nodded, but something broke inside her. Her daughter had apologized for her husband, but hadn't tried to stop him, hadn't stood up for her mother when he'd insulted her. She just stood there silent, eyes downcast. And you brought... Rebecca stammered, hesitant to finish her sentence. Betty knew what she was asking. Money. 120 pounds for a non-existent uniform for Austin. She finished her tea slowly and put the cup back on the tray. Yes, I brought it, she replied. But first, I wanted to ask Austin about this uniform. What color is it? What sport is it for? Rebecca paled. Regular, she said quickly. Blue, for physical education. That's odd, Betty said. When I went to the school store last week, they told me they wouldn't have new PE uniforms until September, in time for the start of the school year. That was a lie. Betty hadn't gone into any school store, but she wanted to see her daughter's reaction, and she didn't disappoint. Rebecca blushed and began nervously rubbing the edge of the tablecloth. Yes, but Austin needs it now because the old one's all worn out, and they've got a competition between classes coming up. Betty looked at her daughter sadly. The lie was obvious, clumsy as always. Rebecca had never been good at lying as a child. Her flushed cheeks and running eyes had given her away. That didn't seem to have changed over the years. Could I see his old uniform? Betty asked softly. Why? Rebecca asked sharply. Just wondering how much wear and tear it's had. Maybe it could be repaired. I'm not bad at sewing, you know. Rebecca stood up, clearly nervous. Mom, there's no need. We've already decided to buy a new one. If you brought the money, give it to me, and let's not talk about it anymore. The door slammed in the kitchen. It looked like Hugh had gone out into the yard. It was his usual route when he wanted to smoke. Betty knew she only had a few minutes until he came back. She opened her bag and pulled out an envelope of money. Rebecca held out her hand, but Betty was in no hurry to hand over the envelope. You know, I've been thinking all the way here, she said slowly. Thinking about you and me, about what we used to be and what we are now. Mother, Rebecca interrupted impatiently, let's not do this now. Hugh will be back soon and, it is now, said Betty firmly, because there may be no other now. You're afraid to speak in front of him, afraid to show that you have your own opinions, your own feelings. That's not life, Rebecca. You don't understand anything, Rebecca snapped back. We're fine. We're just going through a rough patch. It's been a rough patch for a few years now, Betty pointed out. And all this time I've been trying to help, with money, with taking care of the kids, with advice you've never listened to. I thought I was doing it for you and the grandchildren. But today I realized something important. She looked at the envelope in her hands, then back at her daughter. I realize that I'm not helping you. I'm supporting an unhealthy situation. Every time I give you money for another made-up need, I am complicit in the deception. Every time I remain silent in response to Hugh's rudeness, I teach my grandchildren that such behavior is normal. Rebecca looked at her mother with disbelief and growing irritation. What's your point? If you don't want to give money, just say so. There's no need to lecture. Betty rose slowly from her chair. She felt strangely calm, as if she had finally found the answer to a question that had long tormented her. I won't give you any money, she said in a steady voice. Not now, not in the future. With these words, she took the envelope with both hands and tore it in half. White rectangles of bills showed in the tier and then sprinkled on the floor as Betty tore the envelope open once more. What are you doing? Rebecca exclaimed, rushing to pick up the money. I won't be your ATM anymore, Betty said quietly, looking at her daughter kneeling among the torn bills. I love you, Rebecca. I always have and I always will, but I can't keep being a part of this. She picked up her bag, turned, and headed for the door. Stop! Rebecca jumped to her feet. You can't just walk away. We were counting on that money. Betty stopped in the living room doorway and turned around. What exactly were you counting on, Rebecca? On new uniforms for Austin that don't exist? Or on new sneakers for Hugh? Or maybe a new smartphone for you? Rebecca opened her mouth but couldn't come up with an answer. Her face was a mixture of anger, shame, and confusion. Is Grandma leaving? Came Nell's voice. Nell's voice sounded, and she looked at the adults anxiously. Yes, sweetheart, Betty said softly. I have to go home now, but we'll see each other again. She walked over to her granddaughter, kissed her on the top of her head, and went into the hallway. There, she quickly put on her coat, not waiting for Rebecca to come out of her stupor. Tell Austin I love him, Betty said, grabbing the doorknob. At that moment, the front door swung open, and Hugh appeared with a cigarette in his teeth. Are you leaving already, dear mother-in-law? He grinned. So soon? What about the family dinner? Some other time, Betty replied calmly as she passed him on the porch. Dash, dash, Mom, Rebecca shouted, appearing in the hallway. Wait, you can't just leave. But Betty was already walking down the path toward the wicket without turning around. She could hear Hugh asking Rebecca something, and she answered confusedly and nervously. But she could no longer make out the words, only the intonations. His mocking and angry, hers excusing and frightened. It was not until she was outside the gate and on the street that Betty felt her hands shaking and her heart pounding. What she had done was completely unlike her. All her life she had tried to avoid conflict, to smooth over sharp edges, to compromise. Even when she knew in her gut that she was being used, that she was being lied to, she preferred to pretend to believe, just to keep some connection with her daughter and grandchildren. But today, something had broken. Maybe it was Hugh's words, old parasite, thrown with such careless cruelty. Or Rebecca's acquiescence, her downcast eyes, her inability to protect her own mother. Or maybe it was just the accumulated realization over the years that nothing changes or will change until she makes the first move herself. Betty walked down the street, not noticing the passers-by or the weather. Her mind was spinning with thoughts of what would happen next. Maybe Rebecca would call her in a few days, when she'd cooled off and they could talk like adults. Or maybe this fight would be the last straw, and her daughter would stop talking to her altogether. And what about the grandchildren? Would Hugh let them see their grandmother after something like this? But strangely enough, these troubling thoughts did not cause panic. Betty felt surprisingly relieved, as if she had dropped a heavy weight she had been carrying for too long. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she was sure of one thing. Today, she had made the right choice. For the first time in years, she had done what she thought was right, not what others expected her to do. The bus stop showed up ahead. Betty quickened her step as she saw the bus approaching. Before she could jump through the closing doors, she sank into the seat and finally exhaled. It was going to be a long ride home, but somehow that didn't scare her. She had time to think, time to realize what had happened and decide what to do next. The bus pulled away, taking Betty away from her daughter's house, from the torn bills on the floor, from Rebecca's stunned face. Perhaps she had just destroyed the last bridge between them. Or maybe it was the opposite, laying the foundation for a new, healthier relationship. Time would tell. For now, she was just driving home to her small, quiet house, where she had roses to water and a new chapter of life to begin. Betty awoke to the ringing of the telephone. The old machine on the nightstand beside her bed was blaring a shrill trill, jerking her out of sleep. The clock read 7:20 in the morning. Who would be calling so early on a Sunday? She reached over and picked up the phone, stopping the annoying ringing. Dash, dash, hello? Mom, it's me. Rebecca's voice sounded strained. Dash, we need to talk about yesterday. Betty sat up on the bed, pressing the receiver to her ear. The events of yesterday came instantly to mind. Hugh's insult, her daughter's silence, the torn envelope with the money, and her own departure, unexpectedly decisive, completely unlike her. What exactly do you want to discuss, Rebecca? Dash, she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. You've put me in a terrible position, she said, irritation in her daughter's voice. Hugh has been furious all evening. He thinks you made a scene on purpose to break us up. Betty felt a familiar anxiety building up inside. In the past, she would have started apologizing, explaining her actions, seeking a compromise. But today, something was different. What do you think, Rebecca? She asked instead. A pause on the other end of the line. I think you could have just refused to give the money if you didn't want to. You didn't have to make a spectacle of tearing up the bills. You're right, Betty agreed. I could have just said no, just like you could have just been honest about why you needed the money instead of making up a story about sports uniforms. Dash, dash, Mom, Rebecca exclaimed indignantly. And, Betty continued, not letting her daughter interrupt, You could have stood up for me when your husband called me an old parasite, but you chose not to say anything. You know what he's like, Rebecca started. I do, Betty interrupted, and I know what you're like. But yesterday, I realized that I can't and don't want to be a part of this situation anymore. She took a deep breath. I need time, Rebecca. Time to think and sort myself out. Please don't call me for a while. And Betty hung up the phone without waiting for her daughter to answer. Her hands were shaking and her heart was racing, but in a strange way she felt relieved. The phone rang again almost immediately. Betty stared at it without moving from her seat. After the 10th ring, the machine went silent, but after a minute it rang again. This cycle repeated several more times until Betty finally picked up the receiver and placed it next to the machine, disconnecting the phone from the line. The silence that came over the house seemed unaccustomedly deep and soothing to her. She got up, put on her robe, and went into the kitchen to put the kettle on. The day promised to be unusual. After breakfast, Betty dressed and went to the nearest telephone company office. There she applied for a change of number, explaining that she was bothered by unwanted calls. The employee, a young man with a friendly smile, assured her that the new number would be activated within 24 hours and gave her a sheet with the future numbers. Don't forget to give the new number to the people you want to keep in touch with, he reminded her. I will. Betty nodded, although she was mentally making a very short list of such people. She left the office and headed for the bus stop, but on her way out, a brightly colored poster on the bulletin board caught her eye. Drawing Courses for Beginners, the headline read. Unleash your creativity. Perfect for retirees and anyone who wants to try something new. No experience required. Betty paused, looking at the poster. She'd loved to draw at school, but then life had taken its toll. School, work, marriage, a baby. Once she dreamed of finding time for creativity in retirement, but after retirement, all her energies went to help her daughter and son-in-law, to take care of her grandchildren. The decision came spontaneously. Betty wrote down the address and time of the classes. The first one was to be held tomorrow, Monday, at 10 o'clock in the morning, at the city's community center. Well, why not? It could be the beginning of a new chapter in her life. Returning home, Betty found her neighbor Esther on the porch, clearly waiting for her. Betty, dear, she exclaimed when she saw her friend. I've been trying to call you all day. Is your phone out of order? I turned it off, Betty admitted, unlocking the door. Will you come in for a cup of tea? Esther didn't have to beg. 5 minutes later, they were sitting in Betty's kitchen, the kettle whistling on the stove. Had something happened to you? Esther asked, looking at her friend carefully. You're somehow different today. Betty sighed. She and Esther had been neighbors for 15 years, and although they weren't very close, they had always maintained a friendly relationship. I had a fight with my daughter and son-in-law yesterday, she said, setting the cups down. Or rather, I just decided that I wouldn't tolerate certain things anymore. And she recounted yesterday's visit, omitting the most unpleasant details, but not hiding what had happened. Oh dear. Esther shook her head sympathetically. I've always found Hugh an unpleasant fellow, but you did well to tell them the truth at last. The truth is, Betty said quietly, that I've let it happen for years. I've turned a blind eye to their deceit, tolerated their neglect, all so I wouldn't lose touch with my grandchildren. But yesterday, something broke inside me, and rightly so, Esther said firmly. You can't let people treat you like that, even if they are your own family. They drank tea and talked about the past, about children. Esther had a son living in America. About how hard it is sometimes to let go of those you love, to let them live their lives even if you don't like it. By the way, said Esther, when the tea was drunk and the conversation was coming to an end, your Rebecca called me this morning, asked if I knew why your phone wasn't answering. Betty tensed. And what did you tell her? That I had no idea. Esther shrugged. I really didn't know, but she said to tell me if I saw you that she really wanted to talk, that it was important. Betty stared into the empty cup in silence. Part of her wanted to call her daughter, to listen, to try to patch things up. But the other part, the part that was growing stronger by the hour, said firmly, no, not now. I'm changing my phone number, she finally said. I'll give you a new one when it's connected, but please don't give it to Rebecca until I'm ready to talk to her. Esther looked at her friend carefully. Of course, dear. That's your right, but children are children, you know. Sometimes they do stupid things, but they're still our children. I know, Betty nodded, and I'm not going to cut Rebecca out of my life. I just need time. Time for myself. After Esther left, Betty did the housework, washed the laundry, dusted, watered the houseplants. The routine was soothing, allowed her thoughts to flow freely. She thought about her life, about how she had always tried to be good, a good daughter to her parents, a good wife to Roy, a good mother to Rebecca, a good teacher to her students, always putting the needs of others before her own, considering any attempt to take care of herself selfish. Roy often told her this. Betty, you give too much and take too little. That's the road to burnout. But she didn't listen, thinking his words were a show of concern but not the real problem. And here she is, a 65-year-old widow whose only daughter sees her only as a source of financial support and whose son-in-law openly despises her. What has she gotten as a result of her endless self-sacrifice? That evening, lying in bed with a book she couldn't read because of the thoughts swarming in her head, Betty made a decision. She would give herself 3 months completely to herself. No calls from her daughter, no financial assistance to Rebecca's family, no guilt or anxiety. 3 months to figure out who she really was, without the familiar role of ever giving and never asking mother and grandmother. The thought was frightening and exhilarating at the same time. Betty turned off the light and lay in the dark, listening to the ticking of the old clock on the wall and the sound of the wind outside the window. As she fell asleep, she thought about the art course, about the colors she would choose for her first painting, and these thoughts were surprisingly light and peaceful. Monday began with a slight excitement. Betty carefully chose what to wear to her first painting class. In the end, she decided on blue pants, a white blouse, and a light scarf with a floral print. An outfit modest enough, but neat. She even applied a little makeup, just a little, just to look fresher. The community center was in a restored Victorian building in the park. Betty arrived 15 minutes before class started, but several people were already there, setting up easels and laying out art supplies. Welcome, greeted her a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and an energetic smile. I'm Lydia, who teaches these courses. Are you here for drawing? Yes, Betty nodded, suddenly feeling unsure. I saw the ad and thought, even though I can't draw at all. Oh, that's not a problem, Lydia assured her. Our courses are just for beginners. Choose any available easel and make yourself comfortable. Everything you need is on the tables. Betty chose a window seat with a view of the park. She laid out her brushes, paints, and paper, feeling a mixture of excitement and awkwardness. Other participants were gathering around, mostly women her age or slightly younger, but there were a few men as well. Good morning, everyone, Lydia began as everyone took their seats. Before we start drawing, let's get acquainted. Please introduce yourselves and say a few words about why you are here. The participants began to take turns introducing themselves. There was Doris, a retired accountant who had always wanted to learn how to paint sunsets. There was Alfred, a former bus driver whose wife insisted he find a hobby after retirement. There was Prudence, recently widowed, who was looking for a way to cope with grief. When the turn came to Betty, She said out of the blue, "My name is Betty Q. I'm a former elementary school teacher. I'm here because I've decided to finally start living for myself, not just for others." Her words elicited nods of approval and smiles from the other participants. Prudence, seated to her right, smiled especially warmly. "A wonderful reason," Lydia said. "Many of us only come to this decision as we get older, but better late than never, right?" The first class focused on the basics: how to hold a brush, how to mix colors, how to create simple shapes and lines. Betty became completely immersed in the process, forgetting about time and her problems. When Lydia announced the end of the class, she was surprised to find that 2 hours had already passed. "You're very receptive," Lydia told her as she looked at her first sketches. "You definitely have a sense of color. Keep practicing and you'll be surprised at the results." Prudence, gathering her things, turned to Betty. "A few of us usually go to the cafe across the street after class. Would you like to join us?" Betty hesitated for a moment. Usually she rushed home to be available in case Rebecca or the grandchildren needed anything. But now, "I'd love to," she replied. The cafe was a cozy place overlooking the park. Betty, Prudence, Doris, and another course participant, Vivian, ordered tea and cakes and spent an hour chatting about painting, their families, the books they had recently read. It was a simple, no-nonsense conversation, but Betty felt surprisingly comfortable. "We meet here every Monday and Thursday after school," Doris said as they left. "We'd love to see you again, Betty." "I'll be sure to come," she promised, and it was a sincere promise. On the way home, Betty felt a lightness she had not felt in a long time. It was as if something had shifted inside, opening up space for new feelings and thoughts. Her new phone number was activated on Tuesday, and the first thing she did was call Esther to let her know. Then she made a short list of people who should have known how to contact her. A few former co-workers she kept in touch with, a doctor, a library where she was a regular reader. Rebecca's name wasn't on that list. Not because Betty didn't love her daughter, she loved her with all her heart. But for the first time in years, she allowed herself to think about her own needs, her right to respect and dignity. On Wednesday, working in the garden, she noticed Esther waving at her over the fence. "Betty, your daughter's here," shouted the neighbor. Betty straightened up, wiping soil from her hands on her gardening gloves. "When?" "She just left. Knocked on your door, but I guess you didn't hear." Esther moved to the wicket to talk closer. She looked upset. "Asked me if I knew where you were? And what did you say?" Betty felt a prick of alarm. "Said you were probably at your new art class." Esther shrugged. "Don't worry, I didn't give her your new number." Betty nodded, grateful for the understanding. "Did she say anything else?" "Yes, she said to tell you that she really needed to talk to you. Something about Hugh and his attitude toward you. She said she wanted to apologize." Betty stared at her roses in silence, thinking about her daughter's words. An apology. Before, she would have softened immediately, called Rebecca, told her it was all right, that they could just forget about what had happened. But now she realized that a simple apology wouldn't solve the underlying problems in their relationship. "Tell her if she comes again that I got her message," Betty finally said, "and that I'll contact her when I'm ready to talk." "Are you sure?" Esther asked. She really did look upset. "I'm sure," Betty answered firmly. "I'm not stopping being her mother, and I'm not giving up communication forever. I just need some time to sort myself out." Esther nodded understandingly and walked away, leaving Betty alone with her roses and her thoughts. The next days brought a new routine: painting classes twice a week, tea parties with new acquaintances, quiet evenings with books or television. Betty began to notice that she thought less about her daughter's problems and more about what she wanted to do herself. She even signed up for a cooking class on Saturday, something she never would have done before, considering weekends family time, even if her family wasn't particularly eager to spend it with her. On her way back from the library one evening, Betty caught her reflection in a store window and didn't immediately recognize herself. It wasn't that she had changed much outwardly in those 2 weeks, but something in her facial expression, in her posture, was different. Did she look calmer, more confident, younger? Betty smiled at her reflection. She was beginning to realize that she deserved respect, not only from others, but above all from herself, and that realization was changing everything. The end of September was surprisingly warm and sunny, as if summer had decided to stay a little longer. Betty stood at the entrance to the city's exhibition hall, nervously adjusting the collar of her blouse. Today was the opening of an exhibition of work by participants in the Senior Citizens course, and among the exhibits was her watercolor, a landscape of roses from her own garden. "Don't worry so much," Prudence, who had become a close friend over the months, squeezed her elbow reassuringly. "Your work is beautiful." "Thank you," Betty smiled. "It's just strange to think that my paintings would be on public display. I never thought I'd live to see it." They entered the hall, already filled with people. The organizers had turned an ordinary room into a real gallery, a gallery with lights for each work, and plaques with the author's name and the title of the work. Betty and Prudence walked slowly through the room, stopping at each painting, exchanging impressions. "Oh, look, Alfred's work," Betty pointed to a colorful cityscape. "He was so afraid he wouldn't finish it in time for the exhibition." "It's very good," Prudence nodded. "Here are your roses." They walked over to Betty's watercolor. The pink and white flowers looked delicate and bright against the greenery. Lydia, their teacher, had placed it in a well-lit spot. "Dash gorgeous," came a voice from behind them. "Is this really your work?" Betty turned around and froze in place. Rebecca was standing in front of her in an elegant blue dress with a new haircut that made her face look more open. She looked both familiar and foreign at the same time. "Rebecca?" Betty struggled to control her surprise. "What are you doing here?" "I saw the poster," she replied, smiling slightly embarrassed. "Your name was on the list of participants. I didn't know you painted." "There's a lot you don't know about me." The words came out before Betty had time to think them over, and sounded harsher than she intended. Prudence stepped back tactfully, pretending to be interested in a nearby painting, but Betty knew that her friend was in control of the situation and ready to help if necessary. "I deserve it," Rebecca said quietly. "Can we talk? Maybe have coffee somewhere?" Betty hesitated. She hadn't contacted her daughter once in the past 3 months, although she knew from Esther that Rebecca had traveled to her house several times. She felt she wasn't ready to have that conversation yet, but looking at her daughter now, she saw something new in her eyes, a mixture of remorse, determination, and weariness. "All right," she finally agreed. "There's a cafe across the street, but I don't have much time. My friends and I were going to celebrate the opening of the exhibition." She walked over to Prudence and whispered her plans in her ear, and she nodded understandingly. "If anything, we'll be at the Blue Cup as agreed. Join us when you can." The cafe across from the exhibition hall was half empty. Most of the customers at this hour preferred more serious places for lunch. Betty and Rebecca took a table by the window. Betty ordered tea, her daughter a cappuccino. "You look nice," Rebecca began after an awkward pause. "You look refreshed." "Thank you," Betty said discreetly. "You've got a new haircut." "Yes, I've decided to change my image." Rebecca touched her hair. A lot of things had changed in the last few months. There was another pause. Their order came. Betty didn't hurry to help her daughter start the conversation. Let her find her own words. "Mother," Rebecca finally said, looking into her cup, "I owe you an apology. for everything, for the way we treated you, for using you, for not standing up for you when Hugh. She fell silent, searching for words. When Hugh insulted me, Betty finished for her. It wasn't the first time, Rebecca. It was just the day I finally decided I'd had enough. I know, Rebecca said quietly. And you were right. We, I behaved horribly. I was comfortable taking money from you, but I kept my distance so I wouldn't feel obligated. It's despicable, and I don't know how you can forgive me. Betty looked at her daughter in silence. Part of her wanted to say, "It's okay, honey. I understand. Let's just forget about it." That's what she'd always done. But the other part, the part that had grown stronger during these months of living on her own, reminded her true forgiveness was only possible after a full admission of guilt and a change in behavior. "What happened in those months, Rebecca?" she asked instead. "Why did you decide to find me now?" The daughter took a sip of coffee, gathering her thoughts. "After the day you left, things got worse. Hugh was furious about the money. He yelled at me, accused me of not being able to control my own mother." She grinned sadly. "Dash, as if you needed to be controlled." Anyway, we had a big fight, and for the first time, I told him everything I thought about his attitude toward you, toward the children, toward me. She was silent, remembering those difficult days. "He moved out," she said finally. "Said he needed space to think. That was 2 months ago. At first, I was in a panic, how I'd cope with the kids, with paying the bills. But then it got easier. The kids were calmer. There was no more tension in the house, and I started to notice how toxic the atmosphere was when he was around." "And now?" Betty asked. "Is he back?" "No," Rebecca shook her head. "We only talk to each other because of the kids. He takes them away for the weekend every 2 weeks, but it's over between us. I've filed for divorce." Betty couldn't hide her surprise. Despite all her problems, she'd never thought Rebecca would find the strength to leave Hugh. Her daughter had always seemed so dependent on him, so incapable of making her own decisions. "Was it a hard decision?" she asked gently. "Yes and no." Rebecca smiled weakly. "It was hard to admit that I'd wasted 15 years in a relationship that was slowly destroying me, but the decision itself, it came naturally when I saw how much better we were all without Hugh." She looked Betty in the eye. "You know, when you left that day, I was shocked. At first, I was angry with you. How could you do that? How could you leave us? But then I started to remember how we'd treated you over the years, how I let Hugh insult you, how we were always asking for money under false pretenses, and I felt so ashamed, Mother." Her eyes filled with tears. "I tried to find you. I called, I went to your house, I asked a neighbor, but you just disappeared. And I realized that maybe it was forever, that I had lost not only my mother, but the only person who truly cared for us without asking for anything in return." Betty listened silently, not interrupting. She saw the sincerity in her daughter's eyes, heard it in her trembling voice, but she also remembered years of neglect, of deceit, of acquiescence in Hugh's rudeness. "What do you want of me now, Rebecca?" she asked bluntly. Her daughter looked surprised at such a question. "Yeah, I want you back in our lives," she said after a pause. "The children miss you, especially Nell. She's always asking when Grandma's coming." "And you?" Betty asked. "Do you miss me or my help?" Rebecca flinched as if slapped. "That's cruel, Mother." "Maybe," Betty agreed, "but it's an honest question. I don't want to go back to the way things were, Rebecca. I won't be your ATM machine that doesn't even say thank you. I won't silently take your husband's or ex-husband's insults. I won't pretend everything is fine when it isn't." She took a sip of tea, giving her daughter time to consider her words. "I miss you, Mom," Rebecca said quietly. The real you, the one I think I'm only now beginning to recognize. I don't expect you to help us with money. To be honest, she smiled weakly. I'm doing pretty well right now. I've been promoted to senior stylist at the salon, and I'm working part-time doing haircuts at home on the weekends. Betty looked at her daughter in surprise. Rebecca really did look different, more confident, more collected. Even her way of speaking had changed. Less excuses, more direct. I'm happy for you, Betty said sincerely. But I need time, Rebecca. You can't expect that after 3 months of silence, we'll just go back to being together as if nothing had happened. I understand, Rebecca nodded. But maybe we could start small, like the kids could come visit you on the weekends. They really miss you. Betty thought for a moment. She really did miss her grandchildren, especially Nell, with her sincere hugs and inquisitive questions. And Austin, so much like Roy in his seriousness and hidden vulnerability. Just the children? She asked. Only them, Rebecca confirmed. I realize you might not be ready to see me regularly, and I respect that. Betty nodded. That sounded reasonable. Baby steps. Good. Let them come over this Saturday if they want. I'll be home all day. Rebecca's face lit up with joy. Thank you, Mom. They'll be so happy. I'll bring them in the morning and pick them up in the evening. Or, if you like, they can stay overnight. We'll see, said Betty, not wanting to agree to too much at once. Just a day for starters. They finished their drinks in a more relaxed atmosphere. Rebecca told us a little about the children, that Austin was doing better in school, and that Nell had joined an art class, inspired by her grandmother's example. When Esther told us you were taking an art class, Nell decided she wanted to take one. Rebecca smiled. She says she's going to be a great artist like Grandma. Betty couldn't help smiling back. Dash, I can hardly be called a great artist. I'm just learning. But your painting is really beautiful, said Rebecca. It's your garden, isn't it? The roses you and Daddy planted? Yes, Betty nodded, touched that her daughter had noticed and remembered. They bloom better every year. The conversation gradually dried up. Betty looked at her watch. She had promised her friends she would join them at the Blue Cup. I've got to go, she said, pulling out her purse. I'll pay, Rebecca said quickly. Betty wanted to object out of habit, but then nodded. Thank you. They walked out of the cafe and stopped on the sidewalk. The day was still warm, but they could already feel the breath of fall in the air. Thanks for agreeing to talk, Rebecca said. I know I don't even deserve this. Everyone deserves a second chance, Betty replied. But don't expect things to get better right away, Rebecca. We have a long way to go. I know, her daughter nodded, and I'm ready to go down it. I really am. They said goodbye awkwardly. Rebecca made a movement as if she wanted to hug her mother, but stopped, unsure of the reaction. Betty also hesitated, but then stepped forward and gave her daughter a quick hug. The hug came out stilted but sincere. See you Saturday, Betty said, pulling back. See you Saturday, Rebecca echoed, and walked to her car parked across the street. Betty stared after her, feeling a mixture of emotions, hope, wariness, longing for what might have been between them all those years ago. But she didn't let herself sink too deeply into those thoughts. She had a plan for today, friends who were waiting for her, a life that went on. She adjusted her scarf and made her way to the Blue Cup, where she was already greeted with smiles by Prudence, Doris, Alfred, and the other members of the art classes that had become part of her new life over the months. Is everything all right? Prudence asked quietly as Betty sat down beside her. Yes, Betty nodded. I think so, and that was true. Maybe not everything was perfect. Maybe the relationship with her daughter would never be as close as she would have liked. But she no longer felt used, no longer put the needs of others before her own. She had found balance, found new friends, new interests, A new self. Saturday morning, Betty woke up earlier than usual. She cleaned the house thoroughly, made her grandchildren's favorite chocolate chip cookies, bought new pencils, and a sketchbook for Nell. She didn't know how the day would end, whether they could regain their former intimacy, but she was willing to try. At 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Betty took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and went to open it. Austin and Nell stood on the doorstep with backpacks over their shoulders. Rebecca waited at the gate, giving the children and mother space to meet. "Grandma!" Nell exclaimed, rushing into Betty's arms. "Hi, baby." Betty hugged her granddaughter tightly, breathing in the scent of her hair. "I missed you so much. I missed you too. Forever," Nell said dramatically. Austin approached more reservedly, but hugged his grandmother too. "Hi, Grandma," he said. "You smell great. Are those cookies?" Betty laughed, feeling the tension of the last few months begin to let go. "Yeah, it's your favorite. Come on in and let me know what's new." She waved to Rebecca, letting her know everything was okay, and she waved back before getting into the car and driving away. The children entered the house, talking excitedly about school, about friends, about how their lives had changed since their father had left. Betty listened, asked questions, offered cookies and hot chocolate. It was a good day, a day of starting something new. She didn't know what the future would bring, whether her relationship with her daughter would be fully restored, how long this new phase of their lives would last. But she did know one thing: she would no longer sacrifice herself for others. She had learned to value herself, her time, her desires. And that was the most important lesson she could pass on to her daughter and grandchildren. At the end of the day, when Rebecca came to pick up the children, Betty suggested, "They can stay the night if they want. I have everything they need." The children looked hopefully at their mother, and she agreed after a little hesitation. "Okay, if you're sure. I'll pick them up tomorrow afternoon." "All right," Betty nodded. "And Rebecca, thank you for bringing them." It was a small acknowledgement, a small step forward, not forgiveness, not oblivion, but a new beginning. And for Betty, that was enough, for now. The June sun was shining brightly in Betty's kitchen, casting a glare on the teacups and the vase of freshly baked cookies. At the round table, covered with a floral tablecloth, sat 4 people: Betty herself, her neighbor Esther, Prudence, and another friend, Faith, whom Betty had met in a Chinese painting class 6 months ago. "So happy housewarming, dear." Esther raised her cup, and the other women followed suit. "Even though you've only moved 3 houses down the road, it's still a big deal." "Thank you," Betty smiled. "I still can't believe I took the plunge. So many years in the same house. But this one is much more comfortable," said Prudence. "And the garden is bigger. You can plant more of your famous roses." Betty nodded, looking around her new kitchen. The house was indeed more comfortable than the old one, with larger rooms, a modern layout, and, most importantly, no stairs, which was important to her sometimes aching knees. But it wasn't just about practicality. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "a year ago I never would have decided to move. I had too many memories of the old house. It was where Roy and I lived, where Rebecca grew up. But now I realized that I could hold those memories in my heart, and I needed to live in a place that was right for me now." "And it's all yours," Faith added with a slight Tuscan accent. "A new beginning, new memories." "Exactly," Betty agreed. A year was such a short time by the standards of her long life, but how much had changed in those 12 months? Sometimes when she woke up in the morning, she wondered how different a person she had become. Or rather, not different, more real, more herself than she'd ever been before. Since that meeting with Rebecca at the fair, she had gradually let her grandchildren back into her life. At first, they came once a week, then more and more often. Betty enjoyed their company, helping with lessons, teaching Nell to paint, listening to the music Austin loved. But she kept boundaries, never offered money, never interfered in their family affairs with Rebecca, never gave unsolicited advice. The relationship with her daughter was slower to develop. Rebecca tried to get closer, invited her mother to dinners, called, inquired about her life. Betty responded politely but with restraint. She did not hold a grudge, did not recall past offenses, but also did not seek the former false intimacy based on dependence and guilt. Tell us about your new students, Esther asked, bringing Betty back to reality. How many do you have now? 5, Betty answered. 2 fifth graders who need help with math, 1 third grader with reading difficulties, and 2 twin second graders who just can't sit still during class. And how do you manage with such fidgets? Faith asked. Betty smiled, remembering her little students, 2 boys with the same freckled faces and irrepressible energy. I turn the lessons into a game. We take 5-minute breaks every 20 minutes so they can run around the garden. I also bought an hourglass. The children turn it over themselves and see how much time is left before break. It helps them focus. You've always been a born teacher, Esther said warmly. I remember parents lining up to send their children to your class. Don't exaggerate. Betty waved her hand in embarrassment, but it was obvious she was pleased. After retirement, she didn't think she'd ever teach children again. But 6 months ago, a friend from her art class asked her to help her grandson with math, and Betty agreed. Word of the patient and experienced teacher spread quickly among parents, and soon she had more students. She charged a very small fee. The sense of usefulness and the joy of interacting with the children were more important to her. But even this modest income gave her additional independence and the opportunity to treat herself sometimes. New paints, tickets to the theater, or a weekend trip to the sea with friends. And how is your new painting for the exhibition coming along? Prudence asked. Will it be finished by the deadline? It's almost done. Betty nodded. Just a few details to add. This time, I decided to go away from the usual floral motifs and painted a seascape. Remember our trip to Brighton in April? I did some sketches there. Oh, it was a wonderful trip, Faith said dreamily, especially when we sat in that little cafe on the pier and watched the sunset. And when Prudence almost flew away with her hat, Esther added with a sly smile. Everyone laughed as they remembered how a sudden gust of wind had torn Prudence's wide-brimmed hat off, and she had almost fallen into the sea trying to catch it. Their friendly chatter was interrupted by the doorbell. Betty excused herself and went to open it, wondering who it could be. She wasn't expecting anyone. Rebecca stood on the doorstep with a bouquet of wildflowers. Hi, Mom, she said a little uncertainly. I'm sorry to drop by unannounced. I was going to call, but then I thought I'd just stop by. If you're busy, I've got friends over for tea, Betty said, but you can join me if you want. She didn't bother to ask the reason for the visit. Over the years, she had learned not to expect her daughter to come only when she needed something. Sometimes Rebecca really did ask for help with the kids or advice, but more often she just stopped by to talk or bring some of her baked goods. Thank you. Rebecca held out the bouquet. It's for you. I was coming home from work and I saw them on the curb. I remembered when you and I used to collect them for the herbarium when we were kids. Betty accepted the flowers, touched that her daughter remembered these moments from her childhood. Such little things, insignificant memories that strangely bound people together more tightly than high-profile events. They're beautiful, she said sincerely. I'll put them in water. Come in. Rebecca followed her into the kitchen, where the women greeted her with welcoming smiles. She knew them all. They had crossed paths many times over the year at Betty's house or at various town events. Rebecca, dear, Esther exclaimed. Have a seat. We were just discussing a trip to Brighton. You must persuade your mother to take the grandchildren with her next time. They'd love it. I will, Rebecca smiled, taking a seat at the table. Especially Nell, she loves the sea. The conversation flowed easily and casually. Rebecca talked about her work. After her divorce from Hugh, she not only continued to work in the beauty salon, but also began to teach makeup workshops, which proved to be unexpectedly popular. And how is Hugh? Betty asked. Had the children seen him at the weekend? Yes, he picked them up on Friday night and brought them back on Sunday, Rebecca replied. It went well, although Austin has been a little withdrawn since he got back. I don't know what happened there. He won't tell me. Betty nodded. She stayed out of the ex-spouse's relationship, but always wondered how the grandchildren were coping, especially Austin, who was at that difficult age when boys especially need a father figure but rarely admit it. Maybe he'll want to talk about it next weekend when he comes to visit me, she suggested. Sometimes it's easier for kids to open up to someone who isn't directly involved in the situation. Maybe, Rebecca agreed. He trusts you. You and he are so much alike. They're both so reserved, thoughtful. Betty smiled. She was pleased to hear that her grandson trusted her, that there was this special bond between them, despite the months of separation last year. Gradually, the conversation turned to other topics. Faith told of her plans to visit her native Italy in the fall and invited Betty to come with her. I'll think about it, she replied. It's a tempting offer. You ought to go, Mother, Rebecca seconded. You've always wanted to see Florence. Betty looked at her daughter in surprise. Do you remember? Of course, Rebecca nodded. You always had that book with the reproductions from the Uffizi Gallery. You used to show them to me at bedtime and tell me stories about the artists. Betty was touched. Those evenings with the book were some of her warmest memories of motherhood. Little Rebecca snuggled up to her, listening intently to stories of faraway lands and great masters. She didn't think her daughter remembered those moments either. Soon the friends began to pack for home. Betty walked them to the door, hugging each one goodbye and promising to meet tomorrow for art class. Rebecca helped clear the table and wash the dishes, then got ready to go. Thank you for letting me stay, she said, putting on a light jacket. You have wonderful friends. Yes, they're wonderful women, Betty agreed. I'm grateful to fate that I met them. They went out on the porch. The evening was warm, and the air smelled of lime blossoms and cut grass. The garden at Betty's new house was not yet as well tended as the old one, but she had already planted her favorite roses and planted a small bed of perennials. You know, Rebecca said suddenly, looking up at the sunset sky, I often think about the day you broke the money and left our house. I was shocked and very angry with you then, but now I realize that it was one of the most important moments in my life. Betty looked at her daughter in silence, waiting for her to continue. You showed me that even the closest person has the right to say no, has the right to respect and dignity, Rebecca continued. If it hadn't been for that day, I might never have found the strength to leave Hugh, to change my life. She turned to her mother. Thank you for that lesson, Mother, and for not turning your back on us completely, even though you had every right to. Betty felt a lump rise to her throat. She hadn't expected such words, such understanding from her daughter. I will never turn my back on you, Rebecca, she said quietly. You are my daughter, and I love you. I just had to find a way to love you without losing myself. They hugged, not as awkwardly as they had a year ago at the fair, but really, really tight. Then Rebecca got into her car and drove away, waving goodbye. Betty returned to the house, feeling a strange mixture of emotions, a light sadness, a quiet joy, a peacefulness. She went to the window, which overlooked the garden, and stood there for a long time, watching the dusk thicken and the first stars light up. A year ago, sitting on the bus after her daughter's dramatic departure from home. She could not have imagined that her life would change so dramatically. At the time, all she could think about was what she had lost: her relationship with her daughter, the opportunity to see her grandchildren, her way of life. But now she realized that she had gained much more: freedom to be herself, new friends, new interests, new understanding of herself and her needs. And, paradoxically, it was because of this that she was able to build a healthier, more honest relationship with her daughter. Not perfect. There was still distance between them. There were still misunderstandings and tense moments. But this relationship was no longer based on dependency and manipulation. It was real, alive, evolving. In the bedroom, on the bedside table, was a book Betty had recently bought about self-esteem and healthy boundaries. One sentence from it was particularly memorable to her. Sometimes you have to lose a relationship to find yourself. And only by finding yourself can you build truly healthy connections with others. A year ago, those words would have seemed too radical to her, too selfish. All her life, she had believed that love was a sacrifice, that motherhood was a complete dissolution into the needs of a child, that being good meant always putting others first. Now she knew that true love was not a sacrifice, but a gift that could only be given when your own cup was full. That caring for yourself is not selfishness, but a prerequisite to truly caring for others. That respecting your own boundaries teaches others to respect those boundaries. Stepping away from the window, Betty walked to her new living room, where her first painting from the show hung on the wall: roses from her garden. Next to it were pictures of her grandchildren, a few snapshots from trips with her friends, a portrait of Roy, and an old picture of little Rebecca on a swing. Past and present, loss and gain, sadness and joy, all intertwined into a single story of her life. Betty felt no bitterness looking at her daughter's picture. She was not angry at her for past wrongs, nor did she blame her for years of neglect. But neither did she seek fake intimacy, a relationship based on guilt or obligation. She loved Rebecca, sincerely, deeply, but it was a mature love that didn't require constant affirmation, didn't need sacrifice or self-denial. Keeping her distance, setting boundaries, saying no when necessary, it was all a conscious choice she'd made. A choice that was not easy, that required constant work on herself, a constant reminder that her needs were important too. But that choice had given her freedom, not only from the manipulation and control of others, but also from her own destructive patterns, from the habit of self-sacrifice, from the fear of rejection. Betty turned on the desk lamp, creating a cozy circle of light in the thickening darkness. Tomorrow was a new day: a painting class in the morning, 2 students in the afternoon, an evening walk with Prudence. Her grandchildren would be arriving this weekend, and she planned to teach Nell how to make leaf prints on paper and talk to Austin about the book they'd both recently read. Her life was full, interesting, meaningful, and joyful. It wasn't perfect. It still had its moments of loneliness, of longing for her husband, of regretting the past. But it was her life, her choice, her path. And for that, for the right to be herself, for the right to choose, for the right to set healthy boundaries, she was willing to fight for it every day. Betty sat back in her chair with a cup of tea and opened the book on Florence she'd borrowed from the library after her conversation with Faith. Maybe she really should go to see with her own eyes the paintings she knew only from reproductions, to walk the streets of the ancient city, to taste real Italian gelato. She smiled at her thoughts. At 66, her life was not ending. It was just beginning. And that was the most amazing discovery of the past year.